Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Melody Brown-Berkins, the Director of the Institute of Arctic Studies here in the Dickey Center and a Senior Associate Director in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth. I'm also honored to serve as an adjunct professor in the Department of Environmental Studies, which I know many of you are connected to as well. On behalf of the entire Dickey Center team, led by Dickey Center Director Tori Holt, thank you for joining us here in the room and online. It is a true honor to help host Sherri Goodman this evening, a leader whose work has transformed how the United States and the world understand the link between climate and security. Ms. Goodman is truly one of the most respected and pioneering voices in climate security today. A graduate of Harvard, earning her degree there, she went on to complete both a JD at Harvard Law and a master's in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, launching a career that helped shape national and international security policy for decades since. As the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, she led groundbreaking work integrating climate and environmental risks into the U.S. defense planning and its operations. She is widely credited with introducing the term that you see here, Threat Multiplier, about climate, reshaping how the U.S. Department of Defense and broader security communities around the world assess climate risks. Today, Ms. Goodman continues this important work as Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and until its very recent closure, she served as a senior fellow in the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. She advises leaders in the U.S. and around the world on meeting the urgent security challenges posed by our changing climate, challenges ranging from thawing permafrost, affecting military transportation, to rising seas, threatening coastal installations, and warming oceans, distorting sonar. Ms. Goodman also serves on numerous boards and advisory councils, including the Council on Strategic Risks, the Center for Climate and Security, and the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Just yesterday afternoon, I had the privilege of joining Ms. Goodman as she visited the U.S. Army Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory, also known as CREL, right here in Hanover. I watched as several of our nation's most informed scientists and engineers, a few of whom are Dartmouth undergraduate and graduate students working there. I watched them brief her on their research at the front lines of cold regions innovation and research that is increasingly vital to our national security in a rapidly changing Arctic and global climate system. My thanks to CREL Director, Dr. Ivan Beckman, here today, and his team for letting me join Ms. Goodman for both her briefing and the tour of the impressive facility. I know these kinds of knowledge tours, taking in climate and security knowledge and innovation from the best minds around the world, is exactly what Ms. Goodman writes about and will be telling us about with her book talk, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. She draws on decades of service at the highest levels of defense, diplomacy, and policy leadership. Her book challenges us to see climate change not as a distant environmental concern, but as an immediate, pressing driver, a threat multiplier of global instability, and one that demands visionary and courageous leadership. Ms. Goodman shows us why integrating climate action into military and security planning is not optional, it is essential. After her book talk, you will also have the opportunity to hear Ms. Goodman and Director Tori Holt in conversation right here. Then we will also open up for questions from the audience, both in the room and online if we can. Please join me in warmly welcoming Ms. Sherri Goodman to the podium.
Wow, Melody, thank you so much. My mother would have loved that introduction. Okay, it's really great to be here at Dartmouth. It's in many ways sort of a coming a full circle since I actually considered coming to college here, but went to Amherst. I know you. And I visited CREL many, many decades ago, but really had the opportunity to go back there yesterday. And Tori and I worked together many moons ago, and there's some threads so that we'll go through. So mine is a story of how environmental and climate progress can be made sustained over decades and you'll see the progress in the U.S. military and militaries around the world. And it's also the story arc of my own career. So, as told through the book, Threat Multiplier. And these are the topics of the discussion today. And I'm going to go right to the beginning, because the basic premise of the story is this, that over the last 40 years, we've seen a convergence of traditional national security with environment and climate security. And on the top arrow, you see the markers of traditional national security after the Cold War, creation of NATO, the Warsaw Pact, Strategic Defense Initiative, leading us into 9/11, the era of terrorism, and then into beyond, into COVID, and now into the current era, question mark. Then you see on the bottom some of the markers of environmental progress, the rise of environmental laws in the United States, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Superfund, National Environmental Policy Act, and internationally as well, the Montreal Protocol, International Panel on Climate Change. And they've really intersected now in the last decade or so. And so now environment and climate security is part of national security. So I want to start here a little bit at my beginning. I started out, after I finished graduate school, I went and joined the Senate Armed Services Committee staff. I was one of the first female professional staff members. I worked for the chairman of the committee, Senator Sam Nunn. And Dan Riker here, of a Dartmouth alum, was working at the Natural Resources Defense Council at the time. And Dan would come and lobby me. That's how we met. He would come and knock on the committee doors, and he would say, Sherri, what are you doing about all that weapons cleanup and the reactors and the processing facilities and getting your hands around that? And he wasn't the only one, but he was very persuasive even then. That's how he got Carol to marry him. Okay, so anyway, I started out in traditional, what we might think of as traditional national security. I was overseeing the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. And during that time in the late 1980s, all of our weapons reactors and processing facilities failed for environment, safety, and health lapses. And because at the end of the Cold War, we were awash in plutonium and we didn't need to produce anymore. And then we transformed the Department of Energy from one that had been mostly about producing plutonium and tritium and uranium to one that was very much about environmental management and cleanup and environment safety and occupational health and safety of its remaining nuclear complex facilities. And so I say my career then went from weapons to waste. And that is how I transitioned. And I say to many of you who are just figuring out what you want to do, whatever you do now, which is going to be great, I'm sure, because you're Dartmouth alums, or will be soon, may not be where you end up. I thought I was going to be nuclear weapons and arms control. And then I wound up at the Department of Defense as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And I call this era of the 1990s the birth of environmental security. And it really has three parts, I'm going to tell you in 3 short slides here. So the first was about cleaning up contamination of the past. In the 90s, we were closing a lot of military bases and turning the property back to communities and cleaning up active bases. And President Clinton, pictured here, who I am running with, who wanted to be running, or his staff thought he was going to be running with Congressman Ron Dellums. That's out at Alameda Naval Air Station at the Lake Merritt around Oakland, where we did an event in July of 1993 when he announced the closure of the base closure round of about 50 or more major military bases, which were going to cost jobs in many parts of the country, particularly California. And so President Clinton really wanted to lean into this decision in a way that would help those communities. So he wanted job-centered property disposal and fast-track cleanup. And you know, as Carol will remember, there wasn't inherently anything that was particularly fast about cleaning up at military bases. Ivan may remember that too. You know, there was a lot of reviews. You had to get concurrence from EPA and state EPAs. You had to do a lot of assessment, and to do it right, you know, it was a long process. But the president wanted to fast track that. So In that era, for example, I was transferring money out of the defense budget to EPA so that they could keep up with the same pace as us. And by the end of that decade, we had transferred 80% of the property cleaned up for reuse, which was a pretty important goal. Okay, the second part of environmental security in the 1990s was about protecting natural resources. So the first part is about cleaning up pollution from the past. But the second part was about protecting natural resources. Military bases are home to endangered species. They are islands of nature, and the Department of Defense is the nation's second largest landholder after the Department of Interior. And there are many fragile ecosystems. And this red-cockaded woodpecker pictured here lives on in the tree in Fort Bragg and a number of other military bases. And cutting down that tree, which then took away the nest where the bird lives and reproduces, had cost the Army training at one of its major military bases. Basically, the Fish and Wildlife Service had shut down training. And so what's an Army leader to do? So the Army and the Marine Corps, which had the same challenge, determined that instead of cutting down the tree, they could actually leave the tree in place and they could use it as a realistic training obstacle to improve and enhance training. And that showed the first era, and you see that coming back again now as we deal with climate challenges in the last decade or so, that it's not an either or. It's not, well, okay, I got to protect the natural resources, or I can have military readiness. There are ways to do both. And this was an example, and there were many others that we did in that era. The third dimension of environmental security in the 90s was military-to-military environmental cooperation. Something I know, Dory, you've been involved in a lot of cooperation and working with other countries. We were, in this era, trying to share our environmental practices with militaries around the world, and in particular, Russia at the time, where we were removing a lot of their fissile materials and nuclear weapons. We also had the Norwegians in particular had a deep concern that leaking, sunken Russian submarines in the Kola Peninsula were going to contaminate Norwegian fishing grounds. And so the Norwegian Defense Secretary came and said to my boss, the US Defense Secretary Bill Perry, you must engage the Russian military in cleaning this up. And so we launched a program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation. And the leading edge was this cask we built, this white cask here, that allowed the liquid waste streams to be safely offloaded and shipped inland for safer storage. But we also did a lot of environmental exchanges around military academies. And we did this, we even did it with China, the PLA in that era, with militaries around the world, with the combatant commanders, and it really integrated environment and mainstreamed it into our defense planning. Okay, fast forward into the next decade. I was at the Center for Naval Analysis, a federally funded research and development center, and a group of foundations approached me and asked me if I would convene a group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. They were interested in changing the conversation in the United States, which already 2 decades ago had become polarized about climate change. And they thought that military voices might help bridge some of that gap. I was interested in the actual analysis, the research on the security implications of climate change, because we could see already that changing environmental and climate conditions were going to impact our military operations and our security posture around the world. So I brought together a group of generals, admirals, most of whom I had worked with in the prior decade and we'd become closer friends, like the former chief of staff of the Army and the head of the nuclear Navy and many others. And we convened at CNA for a year and learned from the nation's leading climate scientists like Jim Hansen and others about climate change as a scientific matter, as the evidence. And the important point here is that military leaders, warfighters, make decisions based on evidence to manage risk. What's the risk of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union or North Korea? What's the risk of a terrorist attack in this place? What's the cyber threat? So in this case, we treated it just like any other risk we have to deal with. And so after a year of study, we released this report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, where we characterized climate change as a threat multiplier for instability in volatile regions of the world. And we knew it would affect us even in stable regions here at home. And we started connecting the dots on energy, climate, and our security. And that has led to several decades of work and mainstreaming of climate into national security and defense. So these are all obvious to you. I call them the climate threat multipliers, but they are rising heat and drought, changes in drought and fire, sea level rise, permafrost, thaw and melt, flooding, and storms. But it's not just the physical impacts, it's how it results, for example, in the increase in extreme weather events that we are now experiencing. This is just here around the world. You see the dramatic increase in extreme weather events over the last 2 decades, particularly from heat and many other factors. And also, climate change aggravates human pathogenic diseases. Sometimes we think it's just about the infrastructure, but it's really also about the people. And we're going to see a lot more of that disease patterns changing and being affected by increasing climate conditions. And then again, it's beyond the physical impacts. We have to, in a security framework, we are looking for the connections between the physical components and the security outcomes. And so on this slide, which we developed for a State Department study for the ISAB, we took the physical elements and we connected them with changing water and food and scarcity, energy insecurity, and then the other risks of conflict that people in traditional forms are worried about: weak governance, fragile states, migration, changing demographics, and you find that all adds to compounding and cascading risks. Okay, so let's look at how that plays out a little bit around the world. So in the Arctic, a region that's changing, a lot of expertise here with Melody and many others. I tell the story in the book of Admiral Fogo, pictured here, who as a young submariner went up to the Arctic and did this ice pick maneuver you see here, where the sub gets to pop out of the ice and then the sailors can play a little softball or golf. He said, don't use a white ball. You'll never find it. Yellow. Okay. And to send some pictures home to the family because, they're at sea for a long time. Well, then he goes back about 20 years later, and now he's in command of the submarine, and he tries to go back to about the same place near the North Pole, but instead instead of ice, he finds blue water and plastic waste. So now the changing Arctic that we are experiencing today is opening up sea routes. You see pictured on this map, the northern sea route, which hugs the Russian coastline, the longest geographic coastline in the Arctic, which Putin has ambitions to transform into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. Meanwhile, China eyes the Arctic as a near-Arctic power and has developed a polar Silk Road, that concept where it seeks to collaborate with Russia and eventually use that central Arctic route either for navigation, shorter shipping lanes, or possibly in the future, fish. Okay, and we can talk more in Q&A all you want about Greenland and other things. Okay. In the Middle East, a region long, rich in oil and poor in water, becoming more so in the climate era. General Tom Mittendorp, the former Dutch Chief of Defense, pictured here, and my colleague in the International Military Council on Climate Security, did a lot of deployments in this region and found that prolonged drought and increasing water shortages and scarcity were making it much more difficult for NATO and other allied forces to reduce instability that is seemingly tied to terrorists or weapons of mass destruction, but without being able to provide clean water and reliable water security and food security in the small villages, attempts to stabilize these regions become very, very difficult. Okay. In the Pacific, I call it Navigating Disaster Alley. Admiral Sam Locklear, who was the head of PACOM, found that he was deploying many of his forces in response to typhoons and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief events. This is Bangladesh, pictured here after a flood, where already many people, millions of people live at or below sea level in very densely populated, the most densely populated city in the world, Dhaka. And if they are forced to flee, they're moving towards India, which has already erected a fence to keep Bangladeshis out. Elsewhere in the Pacific, you have small Pacific island nations like Kiribati, pictured here, that will be losing parts of their atoll in coming years from a combination of sea level rise and loss of fresh water. And former President Anote Tong, pictured here, has talked about migration with dignity as he seeks to find other places for parts of his population to live. And we see around the world growing climate migration and displacement, particularly among children, in all regions of the world, greatest level of migration we've had since World War II. And we see that affecting our own hemisphere as well. This is General Laura Richardson, who recently retired as commander of Southcom, and found that in this region, in our own hemisphere, while much of what U.S. forces do there is to combat growing Chinese influence in the region, from mining to water to ports to other types of development, increasingly water scarcity, food insecurity, extreme weather events are really complicating the ability of communities to recover and be economically viable and prosperous, sending more people fleeing towards our country and others into Mexico. This is the International Military Council, which General Mittendorf and I co-chair, a group of 40 military leaders focused on addressing the most important security risks of a changing climate and bringing awareness to that. We've helped with NATO in particular. They've had a very dedicated NATO climate action plan, and with other militaries around the world. Okay, let's come back home. I'm going to finish up in a couple of minutes. Our military bases here at home in the U.S. are, of course, like all communities, subject to climate hazards, whether it's sea level rise or strong storms. This is Admiral Ann Phillips, who was in command of Expeditionary Strike Group 2, based at Norfolk, pictured here, our largest Navy base. And in Superstorm Sandy in 2012, she was deploying her ships from Norfolk to New York to relieve the Coast Guard, which had been knocked out at Sandy Hook. And then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta talked about using our military forces in a war against nature herself, and has speculated how that is going to the cascading risks of compounding extreme weather events. And you'll see later on another slide, increasing demand for military response to natural disasters. In the lower picture here is Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, home of the F-35, whose hangars were destroyed in Hurricane Michael in 2018, and now is being rebuilt as the Air Force resilient base of the future to the tune of about $5 billion. And that's just one example. So there's infrastructure, there are troops increasingly affected by hotter temperatures. You have Black Flag days, you can't train. You have to change your training regimes in order to avoid heat stress or heat stroke. Now, okay, a couple minutes on energy, okay? Because it all comes down, the reason we have this challenge is because of the way we use energy. Some people say, okay, well, the military is a big energy user, and it is. It is the nation's single largest energy user, and this is how it uses energy. 2/3 in what we call operational energy. Most of that is for aircraft. And then we have the installation energy as well. So for over a decade now, and even in many ways separate from the focus on climate, there has been an effort in defense to have what we call less fuel and more fight. In Iraq and in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, most of the military convoys, 8 out of 10 of the convoys, were trucking fuel and water to the front. And that put our soldiers and Marines at risk of deadly attacks by improvised explosive devices. And so the military set to work on innovations that will allow it to have to use less liquid fuel in dangerous places and get it from dangerous places, whether it's solar, better batteries, and the like. So a whole generation of military innovation. Here's one example that's coming along now called the blended body wing aircraft, a new design of a fighter that even on existing fuels will be 30% more efficient with improved effectiveness. So again, it's not about reducing, it's not about decarbonizing for its own sake, it's about doing so in a way that you can become more technologically and militarily effective. The military's first net zero base was in Albany, Georgia, has a microgrid, a waste-to-energy plant, and a power purchase agreement with the community. There's a hydrogen-powered nanogrid that's out in New Mexico, testing out how to power in remote places, could be in the Arctic as well. Nuclear energy also will be, the Department of Defense very interested in putting small modular microreactors on military bases. That will lead hopefully to a new generation of safe civilian nuclear energy that can also be deployed in civilian spaces. Okay, last section, how do we get there? I call it climate proofing security. And there are really four parts of it. First is we have to improve our ability to have early warning, or what I call climate prediction, extending weather to climate. That's a whole topic unto itself, but very important, a lot of opportunities there. And then the second is our resilience. The third is energy, how we use our energy. And the fourth is our allies and partners. And so here's an example of how we're going to lead by example in strengthening resilience to extreme conditions, especially if you're not using, I tried to produce this slide. Okay, here's an example of my producing a slide which doesn't have the word climate in it. This is new for me. Okay, so you need early warning of risk. You need to assess the risk, and the DoD, led by some very talented people, some of whom even live and work around here, and with the Army Corps of Engineers have developed the Defense Extreme Conditions Assessment Tool, and then it's about reducing the risk, better health, and performance. Okay, and finally, this is partly the focus on the spatial element, the time element, as well as space. We need to extend our weather predictions out to have more reliable, either we call it short-term climate or extended weather, and that's partly a combination of science and technology and having the right decision-making tools in the hands of the right people in the right sectors. NATO has been very active in this space. Under the last Secretary General Stoltenberg, who was Norwegian defense minister, I think now he's the finance minister, but he'd been the climate minister and the prime minister. I think he's had every hat there, including NATO SecGen. During Ukraine, but very capable and very forward-leaning into NATO's climate action plan. There's a new NATO Center of Excellence for Climate Security based in Montreal. And this is, sort of in closing out, shows you the increase in the number of times that militaries around the world are deploying in response to climate hazards now. An increase just in the last year alone, 240 times around the world, with 131 just in the United States for fires, floods, and hurricanes primarily. Historically, there has been bipartisan support for climate action on the defense bill, one of the few areas. I hope some of that will continue. The tenets of that enable that to happen is that members of Congress, regardless of their party, want their military base to be in place. They want it to be resilient to fires, floods, extreme weather events. And so they're willing to invest in that. The example of Tyndall Air Force case I gave you before. And finally, this all connects in part to peace building. So, and peacekeeping, I know Tori has an expert in that. I had the privilege of getting an award for that last year because ultimately it is about using our military forces also to be a force for good, particularly in this way. Okay, that's the story. The book is out there. It's also available on Audible. I hope that you will find in your own careers and pursuits avenues that are both fulfilling, where you can do good and work with good people. And I think you are all getting a good start by being here at Dartmouth. Thank you for having me here today.
All right. Yeah. Wow, what a career. You really tell a story about changing a conversation by starting with environmental cleanup at federal facilities, which is quite extraordinary to think for a moment that the Department of Defense is one of the second largest landowner in the United States. Is that what you told us? And I think there were either Superfund sites or contaminated sites in every state in the union when you got started on this project. And then you moved to the efficiency question and how to improve supply chains and operations and installations. And now you've moved on to thinking about early warning for climate risk or extreme weather, et cetera. How much do you think that conceptual shift that you've seen both as a leader in the Department of Defense and as an outside analyst and organizer and advocate has truly taken hold? Do you think that the United States military is now well prepared to anticipate extreme climate challenges? And just before you answer, I was struck that in her book, she gives the example that ISIS-Daesh, when it was taking over air parts of, I think, Iraq in particular, made sure that it seized the dams and they would release water onto villages to show who was boss and also to demonstrate power. And we know there are many countries today that do have fights over water and resources. So back to my basic question, which is how much do you think this has now become just part of how we do business in the military? Are we still having a big conversation about whether these kind of assessments are auxiliary outside of the classic defense mission?
Well, I'd say that despite the rhetoric that you hear about it, and even in the recent Secretary of Defense memo that kind of said, well, we don't do climate, it said, but at the bottom it had a long paragraph that said, but we are still going to continue to do environmental assessments and protect our forces from extreme weather and ensure that our bases are resilient. So I'd had what lawyers would call a savings clause that some of us would say you could drive a truck through that. And that was very carefully crafted. Carol and I used to work on those kinds of clauses in our day to make sure that we could institutionalize the changes that we were trying to make. And, in the Department of Defense, a lot of it happens through directives. Every organization has its own form of kind of regulatory standards. And once something's in place, it's not that it can't be changed, but it has to be coordinated and changed through a process. And even a memo, itself doesn't necessarily change that process. So, you think of the military as being a very hierarchical organization with a lot of directive coming from the top and bottom. But anybody who's worked in it knows that if you want to actually institutionalize change, you have to coordinate a lot of policies and programs across and sideways, many different ways. That in itself can take years. But once you've moved that, it is harder to undo. And I think, I think a lot of progress is enduring. It's not that some things can't be rolled back or that some funding can't be moved around. And I think that, some of that will happen. But more that you don't hear about, because it's better sometimes not to talk about it too much, will actually be enduring. And it's because it's a risk. It's not just a woke issue. It's there's a risk to the operational environment. And if the Arctic's warming, the military still has to operate in it. If the seas are rising, the Navy still has to have ships that can, that can travel across, and our submarines still have to be effective even as ocean temperatures rise and ocean circulation patterns change. So it is all about being able to operate in and through those changing conditions.
All right. So I'm going to let the audience know I've got one more question, but then I'm going to turn out to you and look for hands first from students if I could. So there's a lot of debate about whether, and I think you answer some of this in your slide, a change in climate is directly related to an increase or change in conflict. So you gave some examples of extended disease or migration patterns, people becoming overcrowded. But how do you talk about that link between climate and security? Beyond the operational, the point about the Arctic and the different zones.
Well, I do think changing climate conditions, we call it, can be a catalyst for conflict. It's not the sole cause, right? That's the complicating factor. It's never the primary cause. I mean, you have to have political instability or failed governance or weak states. But there are now been countless cases, particularly across Africa and parts of the Middle East, where you see growing water insecurity caused by prolonged drought, where farmers and herders and sometimes fishers, like around Lake Chad or other parts of the Sahel, had lived previously peaceably, and then there's not enough water. So people begin to move, and then they move into the cities. And then as they move to the cities, there are not enough jobs. And then they're, particularly for the young male youth, and they get recruited by terrorist organizations, and then becomes ripe for political instability. And that's the story that we've seen play out in Syria, in parts of Iraq, parts of Afghanistan, in different ways, in different shapes. But yes, I think it can be and water has been weaponized, of course, in the Mosul Dam, in other places, by the insurgents who want to control those key sources.
And just to follow up, is the early warning system you mentioned towards the end something that tries to assess both the impact on populations and those shifts, or is that too nuanced and that's not what early warning's about? Is it more about weather patterns?
Well, there's both, right? So some of the work that has been done at some of the FFRDCs like RAND.
What's an FFRDC?
Oh, a federally funded research and development center, tries to integrate these social, so there's the physical, there's the weather, but
Right.
then there's how does that change how people live or how they move or how they get their food or water. So you have to understand the social, what people call the social determinants. And that set of research and integrating it with understanding the physical changes is a growing, but I'd say newer field. And unfortunately, it's one that even despite the sort of current controversy about this area, is one that in research in general I've often seen it hard to sustain because it's the way our universities often promote people, because you're going to be an oceanographer over here, you're going to be a climate scientist, an atmospheric scientist here, or you're going to do your social science here. But what we're talking about is something that's very interdisciplinary and integrated. And that takes creating new ways of thinking, new departments, allowing for social science research funded out of the National Science Foundation, for example, which we have seen more of in the last decade, but there probably should be even more.
Okay,
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, thank you very much. All right, who would like to join the conversation or has a question for our guest? Right here. Hang on, there's a microphone headed to you.
I was struck, I don't remember who said it, but you shared a quote of someone saying that the US military is going to have to start fighting a war against nature herself. And I'm curious if you think this is it going to become like a real, true war? And is it going to be like the next quote unquote world war that we and other nations are going to have to fight?
No, and maybe I misspoke in the way I said that. Secretary Panetta talked about using our military forces to, because of extreme weather conditions, a war of nature, herself. And what we've seen, as I showed on the slide, one of the last slides, is the increasing number of times our military now deploys to respond to extreme weather events, which is not usually considered part of the traditional mission set for the military. But on the other hand, when Americans' lives are at risk in the floods, the hurricanes we saw in Milton and Helene most recently, or the fires in California, when there's not enough capability in the local first responders, the next level of support and capability is always available first in our reserve, then in our active duty forces and the National Guard. And so you see this happening around the world. And it's not that we're going to fight nature, but we're going to be in a fight that is caused by the changing natural conditions, natural system conditions of climate change.
Great question, yeah.
You didn't mention anything about the cause of climate change. Is that something that you're saying that within the political environment of, say, the last 8 or 10 years, that it's better just to get everybody on board, that they recognize that there is change, and get the cause of it, take that off the table in terms of a conversation?
Essentially, yes. I mean, I don't recall one admiral said he testified before Congress about whether what was the Arctic changing because of climate, and he said, well, Senator, I don't know if it's changing because of climate, but there's a new ocean that wasn't there when I first started in the service. So it doesn't matter what the cause is. In other words, to diffuse the politics around it, which has been controversial more in the United States than in many other places around the world. I think the evidence is abundantly clear, but having a debate about it is less useful than figuring out what to do about it.
And the emissions that come with energy use were being decreased in part because it was more efficient, or you could use different energy sources for installations or operations in Department of Defense, which would reduce the supply chain. You had one point where 1 out of 24 deployed personnel on a convoy could suffer attack or injury. And so you had these other reasons to reduce emissions, which in turn would potentially help reduce climate change. Is that another way to think of it?
I mean, we also say it's more about missions than emissions. It's about the military mission and being effective and efficient. And so we're often very inefficient in the way we use energy, right? One general, Wes Clark, used to say, a tank is an oil spill waiting to happen, right? And another admiral said, well, I know plenty of our military equipment that are just gas guzzlers. We just weren't accounting for it, So once, and again, this is in many ways separate from climate, but when energy costs rose, a couple decades ago, and it became an additional charge on the defense budget, how much extra fuel you had to pay, then the green eye shade types in the Pentagon would say, well, I'm not worried about the climate impact. I just don't want to be paying this extra money. I could be putting it to doing something else, more training, more new weapon systems, rather than paying an extra fuel charge. So if you can be more efficient, you can have more lethality.
Okay. I see hands here, and then over here.
I first want to say thank you. Huge fan of your work, so really great to hear you talk today. I just wanted to circle back to one of your kind of first points about the environment of cooperation with other nations' militaries on environmental factors, especially in the kind of political context that we're in today, where, for the Arctic example, Russian recession and the Arctic Council is no longer cooperating the way it used to. PRC continues to grow emissions, in the United States just withdrew from the international framework for collective action. What is the status of those relationships with other militaries, and what is that cooperation looking like right now, if any?
Right. Well, I think the cooperation within NATO is actually quite good because NATO, which is now 32 nations, thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, now you have Sweden and Finland. So in many ways, you have more robust presence in the Arctic among NATO nations than we've had before. And because of the NATO Strategic Climate Action Plan, the new Center on Climate and Security, with representatives from many of the NATO nations, there's continuing work to integrate at a very practical level, understanding the risks, and also NATO, because NATO forces want to be interoperable, which means that if a communication system on a U.S. aircraft has to be able to talk to the communication system on the Italian aircraft and all the other 32 nations. So there are various what we call standardization agreements, STANAGs, like a standard for a building code, but a STANAG that integrates across a variety of different parameters how NATO forces can become interoperable. Now we're starting to do that on climate and energy. So as we move towards new fuel types, more efficient fuel types, or more solar or better batteries, they should be interoperable across those 32 NATO nations. So that, of course, I think is that's very positive. I'd say there are dozens of countries that have done their own climate security assessment in their defense ministries, and the combatant commanders that we have that are Department of Defense combatant senior, senior leaders across each of the regions, Southcom, PACOM, Central Command, now AFRICOM, and Northcom. They all work with their related countries to bolster. They probably won't be calling it climate security right now, but they'll call it environmental security. There's been a long-standing defense environmental security cooperation dialogue in the Pacific. And that's been hosted sometimes in Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and dozens of countries come and they work on common issues. It could be natural resources, could be contamination, could be managing water, And sometimes these issues are very tactical, but they also help build trust and cooperation and enduring relationships. Obviously, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are missing that piece in the Arctic right now because Russia is not participating in Arctic Council activities. And then there is a gap in the science that is being collected, particularly on permafrost, changing permafrost conditions on the Russian side of the Arctic. CREL here, represented by Dr. Beckman, they are the home and the experts here in understanding permafrost as it affects military operations, particularly mobility. And if you're very nice to him, maybe he'll let you guys come for a tour.
All right. I saw a few other hands here. I think there was a gentleman over here, and then a few over here. Yeah. Oh, you have the mic? Then you have the.
Hi. I wanted to thank you for coming to speak to us today, and I wanted to revisit what you shared about the potential new access to the Arctic with the melting of the ice, especially the Chinese and Russian potential shipping routes between there and the Western Hemisphere. And I wanted to ask if this could potentially pose a real military national security risk in terms of access to the United States and North America, especially with the position of Alaska, how that the change in geography is affecting maybe military strategy.
Well, the most immediate risk that we have defended against in the Arctic for many years is the missile threat from Russia, now China, and North Korea. And that's partly why we have so much of our missile defense based in both Alaska and in northwest of Greenland. And we work very closely with our NATO allies in order to have adequate early warning of any potential first strike or other missile attack, also space-based activities. So now that base in Greenland is now a space base. It was an Air Force base. So that is considered to be the most, the primary threat against which our military forces are deployed. Now, a changing Arctic does open up new sea routes, and sometimes in the summer you will see Chinese and Russian ships off the Alaskan coastline and not very many, if any, American warships, because we're not regularly deploying surface vessels in the Arctic. We haven't retained that capability. We have a very robust nuclear submarine force, and we manage that very carefully to understand how changing ocean and ocean circulation and other conditions affect our ability of our submarine forces to be stealthy and secure and protect the U.S. homeland. Now, China is building out its own Navy and its own nuclear capability. So a more surface-based capability is something the U.S. is going to have to develop in coming years. We have struggled for more than a decade now to recapitalize our icebreaker fleet, which is managed by our Coast Guard, not our Navy. So the Coast Guard has traditionally had icebreakers, and right now we have what we call, what Coasties would call the equivalent of 1.5 icebreakers. How do you have a half, so you say? Well, we have 2 aging icebreakers, and neither of them are fully functional year-round, and they have missions in both poles. One has a mission which is based in Seattle, has a mission towards the Arctic, mostly to do resupply and other Coast Guard missions, which are coastal defense and illegal fishing in Alaskan waters. And the other has a mission down to do the breakout at McMurdo in the South Pole. So, and one of them has had a fire and sometimes is out of service. And we've even looked at leasing icebreaking capability from the Finns or the Canadians while we rebuild our own icebreaker. And we have 2 new icebreakers under construction now. We have a plan for 6, 3 what they call medium and 3 heavy. They call them polar security cutters now. But because we've really lost the art of shipbuilding in the United States, it's very expensive and takes a long time to build a ship. This has been an area of sort of bipartisan concern for a while now to rebuild shipbuilding capability in the United States. But it's very hard to fix because it's very expensive and because we have something called the Jones Act, which prohibits using anything but U.S. vessels in U.S. waters. And that has led to a whole generation of shipbuilders, particularly in South Korea, Indonesia, and other places that can do it much more efficiently and effectively than the U.S., and they ply the international waters. And so while we still build ships, of course, for our Navy, we don't have an effective civilian shipbuilding capability right now. The administration says it wants to work on that. The last administration said it wanted to work on that. I have a lot of friends who say, we want to help with shipbuilding, and I hope it happens, but I'm not holding my breath. The Navy, for its own part, says its Arctic strategy depends also in good measure on having unmanned capabilities. So it's not just about adding surface vessels, it's also about having unmanned systems. And there we have a lot of technological capability. We have a competitive advantage still today, probably in those unmanned systems to operate both for detection, defense, and deterrence.
All right, fantastic. Lost track of the microphone and the hand combo. Let's see here. I saw there's a gentleman over here too.
Got it.
Okay.
Following up on sort of the institutionalization of some of this stuff and practices in the Pentagon, what about where we find ourselves now, in my view, where there's an awful lot of information or initiative coming from some quarters around questioning science, questioning expertise? How does that affect what we need to be doing going forward in terms of paying attention to this from a national security point of view?
Right. Well, thank you, Rob. So, the Department of Defense makes its decisions about risk, what risk to assume, right? Because any warfight involves a risk, right? People lose their lives. And so you always are managing against a set of risks. And those risks have to be based on evidence. So, military leaders and civilians and others in the Department of Defense will continue to fight to be able to make evidence-based decisions. There is a push now in some quarters to remove some of that evidence, to cut research that's already been funded that would look at evidence of X, Y, Z. I mean, I had a reporter call me yesterday about a research grant from the Navy to 2 universities to look at changes in basic research, to look at changes in ocean mixing conditions, like what happens in the water column when you have different animals and different ocean circulation conditions, because that can affect the military effectiveness of different maritime capabilities in the ocean, right? And so as science improves and you can understand that, you can measure it now we have gliders that can go out and take different samples of changes in upwelling patterns. And part of that was based on, I think in the description of the research included the word environmental DNA, because there's DNA of the microbes, the microorganisms that are being sampled. And that, in some sweep, was enough to get this research contract canceled and there was a Republican member of Congress who was objecting to the cancellation. And so the reporter wanted to know, what's the context here? And when I looked at it, it just makes no sense, So will some of that be walked back, just like, when 300 people were erroneously canceled out of the National Nuclear Security Administration, where we manage our nuclear weapons, and then there was oh shoot, we shouldn't do that. Let's put them back on, So there's a lot of these, some of it can be recovered, and some of it may not.
All right, thank you. I think the gentleman over here.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. At the beginning, you left a little goose egg about Greenland. So a lot of us work in Greenland and have a lot of interest and have been watching that closely. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
Well, I had the privilege of going to Greenland last year, where you really you get a bird's eye view. You're seeing climate change happening because you see the great glacier that covers most of the interior of Greenland melting. You hear it, you experience it, so we've long had a security arrangement with Greenland. It is opening up in terms of tourism and accessibility. The first nonstop flights will start from New York to Nuuk this summer. It is true that the waters are becoming more navigable, but we do already have very strong security arrangements in place with our NATO allies and with our military base in Greenland. So I think the talk about Greenland is like the Panama Canal and Canada is intended to be disruptive, intended to be distracting from other issues, maybe part of the thinking about, well, we just have to manage our own sphere of influence. We don't have to worry about being a global leader anymore. Who cares about being a global leader? We just want to have money here at home. Or we want to make money for our favorite people, and there's maybe money to be made as parts of Greenland become, and only in a limited way, I think, given the geography, like Iceland and the tourist boom that it's experienced in the last quarter century. And so you see the eyes of the real estate and commercial developers sort of seeing that, and there's some history that explains kind of Trump's thinking on that, going all the way back to, into the 1970s from his real estate days. So, but it's gotten mixed with a lot of other things. And of course, now we're kind of having irritating and our own allies are astonished, that they can't understand what's going on. Now they're looking at how they might have to defend themselves without the U.S. And so, it's in some ways, you could read it as a continuation of the disruptive, wedge-driving politics that we've experienced in the United States in the last few years, for the purpose primarily of either commercial benefit or just sheer distraction and disruption. That's how and meanwhile, that gives Russia and China more of a free rein in each of their own spheres, right? What are we going to do in Ukraine? Why aren't we calling out Russia as the aggressor? Of course they're their aggressor. Of course they're the aggressor. What are we going to do if we start taking predatory action against Greenland? What does that say to China about Taiwan? We just going to look the other way? They're just waiting for us to look the other way and to upset. And just like we have these tactics now that seem to be getting in the mix of Greenland's own electoral process, they're going to get in the mix of the Taiwanese electoral process. And then they'll just say, oh, well, here, we have it, done. And we won't be able to defend at the distance. It's already so hard for us to defend against a Chinese scenario on Taiwan.
So you've spent much of your career looking forward and seeing what needs to get tackled next. So now that you're at Dartmouth, what would you say to all of us? You've dropped one hint that interdisciplinary work between social sciences, hard science, et cetera, is necessary and maybe hard to keep up. But what would you say to all of us that makes you both a bit hopeful, but also is a future agenda?
Well, I'm hopeful when I look out at this room because you all are, I have 3 kids in their 20s, and I know they're all going to make a difference in their lives, and I know you are too. I do think, there are some technologies on the horizon of, we've always been good as a nation in being competitive in technology development. And there's just a question of how we use it, and can we continue to lead in the areas we innovate in rather than allowing other nations in recent years, mostly China, to really take the lead, whether it's in solar or in batteries or in electric vehicles. It doesn't have to be that way, but we have to have dedicated policies and approaches to address that. And we've been on the verge of doing some of that. Now, maybe we're going to shift sectors. Maybe we'll do some of that in nuclear energy. Maybe we'll do some of that in batteries, criticals. Maybe we'll re-onshore some critical minerals. We'll have new geostrategic issues that I think you all will be exploring here. I do think you're well placed to really be a leader on some of these questions of changing Arctic security because you have a long, great history here. You have CREL, you have your own research here at Dartmouth, the collections that are here. You have the Einstein history from the Manhattan Project. Dan reminded me that Jim Kimeny here was, whom you worked for, right, was one of the early members of the Manhattan Project. So you have a great history on which to build, and that history, I think, can lead into the future, and it can be a place, in the absence of a lot of convening happening in all the right places enabled by Washington today. I see a lot of that happening either in some spaces at the subnational level, like on resilience building and infrastructure can happen by states. You know, California's super active also in its own foreign policy, but it can also happen, I think, in university spaces as you convene. And so I am hopeful
You're
for you.
optimistic, yeah. Well, we do have fantastic faculty, students, institutes here. I want to thank Melody Berkins for her introduction tonight and for helping shepherd this event forward, and everybody for joining us and for your ending on an optimistic note. So please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.